Hi everyone, this is Tim,
This is Morgan LaPlante, a first-year painting student.
and this is the limited palette cast video here. So as you can see, we've already drawn in the shadow map for the cast painting here. I drew that on a separate sheet of paper earlier in the day here before we shot this. It wasn't recorded because we've already gone through cast drawing, so you can just reference those drawing videos. And of course, in those it'll talk all about the measuring, the site size levels and triangulation and all that, as well as how to simplify into a basic shadow map. So here we're digging right into the painting, and this is as I mentioned before, a limited palette painting. But for the underpainting, I'm actually switching up the colors that I'll use a little bit later on. For this open grisaille, I'm just using a standard mixture of burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue to give me kind of a sort of an umberish look to it, with maybe a little warmth that I can spike up the warmth in certain areas too. But just laying down really a basic set of lights and darks in the painting and trying to keep it pretty transparent here. And we're going to try to accomplish this relatively fast so that we don't spend too much time on this underpainting. We get right into the actual top painting, which we're going to paint in various layers here. So you can notice I'm using a pretty big brush here, trying to lay down big broad strokes, painting with the big broad side of the brush there. One thing I've noticed is that too frequently students tend to paint with the edge of their brush, especially if they're trying to paint around something, like I'm painting here around the cast. They sort of use the edge of their brush on its side. And you'll actually find that it's often easier to get a nice, clean, broad, crisp, long line if you're painting with the big, flat, broad side of the brush and just letting the edge of that brush right there create the edge of your cast. And especially with the background here, where the background is less important than the interior, the subject part of your painting, that's a good opportunity to cut into your form and carve it out a little bit without having to be as precise. So you'll actually see a lot of artists who will just paint a large, need to lower that top there. You'll see a lot of artists who paint a large area for their subject, maybe a little bigger than it needs to be, and then cut into it with the background. That was a common thing that Sargent did quite frequently. That allows you to use that big broad side of the brush to carve into the form, to adjust it more precisely and more specifically while still getting a good paint load on the brush. So as I go a little darker here in the background, keep in mind this is still an open grisaille, so the way I'm modifying the values here is just by the addition of thinner. So I'm just laying on paint that has a little less Gamsol in it, which allows the paint to appear a little bit more dark. But I still want to make sure I have some Gamsol in it in this particular case, because I do want it to dry relatively quick so that I can start laying some paint on in the same day here. Keep in mind, you can actually do this type of underpainting without the addition of any Gamsol if you so desire. You'll just have to make sure you use nice stiff brushes and use more of a scumbling technique to lay the paint down. And then you'd probably want to wait a day or two for the thin open grisaille to set up so that you can paint on top of it. What you can't see in the video due to just the sort of limitations of the filming is that the cast shadow that I put down there is actually just a little bit darker than the surrounding values. But as we've had to adjust the exposure so that you'll be able to see more of the subtle modulation of the lights and halftones in the lighter cast area, kind of brings together all of the values of the darker background. So we can't see that quite as well in the video. I'm trying to adjust that up so you can really see the difference between the cast shadow and the surrounding values. Well, they're still quite close, but there's a distinct difference within them. Now I'm starting to lay into the actual cast itself. I switched to a smaller brush. It's still a pretty broad brush, though, wider, more blunt. I think it's a filbert bristle. I like to use the bristles for a lot of the drawing here. especially a filbert bristle that allows me to get some really fine points if I need to, but also lay down a good fair amount of paint. And here I'm just seeing, you can see I wiped off a little bit of paint and then I'm relaying a little bit of paint, and I'm trying to key into what I think is going to be a pretty close value to the area for that cast shadow. Um, so I have a better a shot at being able to get the rest of the cast in there. And you'll see me do this quite frequently. I'll start with a shape that I think is a little more obvious or easy to see a value, or a color that's a little more obvious and easy to see, because that gives me a better opportunity or a better chance, so to speak, of getting it correct right off the bat, which means that the surrounding areas are going to be keyed a little bit more correctly. Whereas if you start with only a half right shape, then where your value is a little off, you might paint all the surrounding values also a little bit off, and then you're sort of off on the wrong foot here. So I'm trying to lock in between my background value and then that cast shadow and then that lighter area of the cast there to get a sort of a triad of values that represents what I'm observing up on the cast. And now I'm just laying into the cast shadow and the form shadows within the ear itself.
So you're figuring out a lot of the value structure here in the underpainting?
Yeah, hopefully if all the values are just as close as they can be here, then all I have to do is add a little bit of color to turn this into a full colored painting. And white is already sort of a challenging color, I guess, to paint for most people, because it just represents a lot of very, very small, subtle shifts of color, which aren't as obvious. The person who's never painted before would look at the cast and say, oh, it's just white. But we have to be trained a little better than that so we can look a little closer and see a lot more subtlety of color. And so by getting the values as close as I can right away, that's going to help me. So later on, I just match the value while mixing these subtle shifts in color. And what you'll see me do a lot on here too is lay down some paint on here and find that it's too dark. But instead of getting worked up or erasing it right away or freaking out, a lot of times I'll just take my brush and put a little bit of terp on it and spread the value out over a broader area. So I did that on the left side of the cast. There I actually spread it around and lifted off a little bit with the paper towel. But I'll first try to do it with the brush, manipulate it with the brush if I can, and then go in with the paper towel, which tends to be a little bit more abrasive. And never really just obliterating it all the way and trying again, but just trying to modify what I have on there. Try to almost think of it as the paint that's on there being thin, being workable. It's almost like clay that you can push around and mold, which makes it a little easier to work with and conceptualize. A lot of students get kind of worked up, a little stressed out that they may have put something wrong on there, and that's not really a big deal. It's this paint is very workable. You can manipulate it very easily. It's just to modify the value, you can just take a clean bristle brush and lift a little bit off, or if you need to get it darker, you can just wait for it to set up for a few seconds and then lay a little bit more on and just scrub it and work it into the area, and the terp will kind of just lift and evaporate out for you. Keep in mind I am working on a panel that has 3 coats of the Gamblin oil alkyd primer on it. So I think it's just a basic linen panel, but it has the 3 coats of primer on it. So not only is it very smooth, which is going to help me get some of the finishes you'll see later, but it's also very forgiving. The paint is very pushable, very workable. I know a lot of artists who actually don't like how slick it is and how pushable it is, but for something like this, and for a student especially, it works out really well, because if you make a mistake, you have a full day or so to be able to lift it off. And in a case like this, you can just kind of keep pushing the paint around to try and get it close to the value that you need it to be. But despite how much pushing I'm doing, how much working around and kind of scrubbing and manipulating of the paint, what you don't see me doing ever on here is softening anything out. You know, you're seeing me dig into the paint, you're seeing me scrape it around and try to push it and modulate the value, but you don't see me feathering anything and trying to make anything smooth. And the reason for this is that I need to maintain as many crisp edges in the beginning as possible. Paint ends up getting, especially when we start to pile more paint on and get thicker, it tends to get kind of smushy and squishy and smeary very quickly. Um, and when that happens, it starts to affect how we perceive values. So, you know, the more hard edges we have, the more sort of visual contrast there is, and that helps the values that we do have on there stand out and pop out as high contrast. Whereas if everything is super, super soft and hazy, then the same values won't read as dynamic and as much in contrast. So keeping these values sharp will first of all allow me to see the greater potential contrast of those values, which will prevent me from over modeling, which is what students end up tending to do to try and compensate for that. They try to push the values in a section to be greater than they should be. So the harder edges will prevent me from over modeling. It'll help things pop out and stand out more immediately as more three-dimensional. And also, on a different note, especially if I'm going to leave some underpainting showing through in later stages, which we don't too much in this painting, but if I were going to leave underpainting showing through in, say, a more alla prima or direct type of painting, then all of the tiny little variations that are showing through here, the sort of random little fraction of value steps and slight different color variations in temperature that we're seeing, because I'm using the two, burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, because of those qualities, it would, if I left any of the paint film open in a direct or alla prima painting, those would show through as little variations of detail. Tiny little random variations, which is really what nature is full of. You know, there's nothing in nature that's one solid flat color. That would appear very kind of flat and graphic and unrealistic. And so these tiny little variations will give it a slightly more organic and natural feel if some of those are allowed to show through. It prevents me from having to actually paint more detail later on if I have left some of this as a little more kind of rough, with the idea that there's, you know, thousands or millions of tiny little micro variations of paint and value in there that as you step back and view it, as we kind of are with the camera here, it all sort of blends or smears together into the appearance of a unified value. It's sort of it's like the idea of broken color, but it's with value, broken value. And so it's going to require you to step back more frequently and require you to squint down quite a bit more and require you to avoid at all costs licking the canvas. You can do some scrubbing, kind of like what I've been doing throughout this painting here, but you definitely cannot do any licking or over blending. I'd recommend just in general not blending anything until the very end of your session, whatever stage of painting you might be at. Getting a little closer here, if you have the opportunity on your computer or whatever device you're watching the video on, to turn this into the whole scene here into black and white, and you'll see how close we're getting with some of the values here, which is kind of key. We want to see how close we can lock into the values of what we're painting. The actual setup that we have here, that I have on the cast and on my painting, is the same light, actually. We don't have any directional focused light on the cast or on my painting. We just have the ceilings that are 12 feet or 13 feet or so high, and we have the cast in a shadow box to isolate it from the surrounding reflected light. So it appears to be a little bit more directional on the cast, as though we had a spotlight on it, but it's not that directional, and it allows us to keep the cast and the painting here in the same lighting conditions, which is not necessarily a requirement in painting, but it certainly makes painting and drawing a lot easier because all we have to do is isolate the value on the cast, and for the most part we know we can get pretty close to those values on our painting. So I would recommend doing this whenever possible, so you have that ease of being able to just isolate with your, looking through a circle of your fingers on your hand, or actually taking an index card and punching a hole in it, and then putting one up on your um, on the reference, and then comparing one to the cast. So having two simultaneously, so you can just look back and forth between the two, and check your values and check your color. It makes things a lot easier, especially if you're just trying to learn this and master all these other concepts. It's better to have less to think about and tackle each of these ideas one at a time and isolate frequently. I know when I was in Chicago painting at the Palette and Chisel, I was isolating obsessively, and I at some point would even take a paper towel roll and put it up on the model stage just so I could see what the value of the model was compared to the white of my paper towel roll, so that I could try to paint those values a little more accurately. If you do end up having a um, spotlight on your cast to get that directional light, just keep in mind that you're going to have to key all the values on your painting a little bit darker, so that you can make your lights by contrast look a little bit lighter. Um, and you're going to have to make sure you don't paint the painting nearly as light as the cast appears. I've seen students do this quite a bit, and what ultimately happens is that the values of their painting gets really washed out because they keep going lighter and lighter and adding more and more white paint in there. And especially for flesh tones, I've seen a lot of open studios where they tend to favor putting a very, very bright, intense light only 6 inches or a foot from the model's head, and it makes them look so light that they're almost impossible looking to paint, and it really washes out or destroys all the color in their face by doing that. And so painting it is not as natural feeling, and you have to adjust your painting style, especially in those open studios that I've been to. They tend to turn off most of the lights above the canvases, so you have a really hard time seeing the value structure and the color that you're laying down on your painting. So it's better to just make it easier on yourself and find a room or a light setup that you like. Hopefully that you can put on both your canvas um, and your subject simultaneously, and be able to just paint them together right next to each other, and just isolate a lot. That is the next logical step when going from a master copy, which was the last painting assignment, which is a limited palette master copy, going from that to painting from life. We don't want to take this huge leap to all of a sudden, having something that's two-dimensional in the same light to having something three-dimensional in completely different lights than our painting. So we take those baby steps. We're bumping up to three-dimensional, which is already more challenging in and of itself because you're going to have to make decisions on what information you need to include or exclude, and how much rendering you're going to do and how you're going to lay down the brush strokes. That's already a lot to think about without having to figure out how to compensate for a very lighter light source on your model than on the painting itself. You can see I'm going into some finer detail now, really with a lot of it smaller light shapes with my paper towel just rolled into a tip. I find that one of the easiest ways to make really, really tiny shapes on an open grisaille. And still digging in with a tiny filbert brush here, bristle still, which allows me to lay the paint on a little more precisely as well as broadly if I need to. But keep in mind, even though I am trying to get variety of shape size here, and I am trying to get all of these shapes to be relatively the right size and shape and edge quality, I'm still not getting into a lot of detail, and that's kind of important to consider because students tend to have a really tough time, especially when they start working from life for the first time. They have a really tough time figuring out how much rendering to do on the open grisaille before they switch to more paint. And so one of the ways that I try to consider it is that, first of all, we're squinting down, but secondly, I'm not considering any little tiny details such as the specks of dirt or chips on the cast or the marks on the wall around the cast. I'm just trying to get the major forms of the ear that I can see when I squint down and flick my eyes back and forth. And any detail that I need to really open my eyes to see, I'm omitting at this stage. And so all of this work that I'm doing now is really just to correct and refine these shapes and maybe get them a little more precise, not necessarily add more detail. So I might carve into the ear to get the shape a little better. I might do a scrubbing, a scumble to try and get the value a little closer, but I'm not trying to add more. And this is a hard thing to kind of gauge for yourself, especially if you're working alone. As an instructor, I can walk around the class and I can tell when somebody's noodling on something and trying to paint too much early on, like, oh, well, you're painting freckles or eyeballs on the model in the open grisaille stage. That's really not necessary. That's something you should be holding on for later. And I can get them to refocus on the larger shapes. Because usually what happens, and the same is true with drawing, is that students aren't getting quite the results they want. Their open grisaille doesn't look as accurate to the model as they want it to, and so they resort to trying to add more information and more detail in hopes that that will make it look more like their subject, and that usually just distracts them from seeing how to correctly resolve and modify and continue to refine the shapes that are important, those bigger, broader shapes and value and edge relationships. I'm going in here with a comber now, a rosemary brush comber, to soften some of the background. I am getting kind of close, I think, to the end of the open grisaille stage here, so I'm just trying to knock down a little bit of the background information so that I can have a better look at the cast itself, and a lot of artists will call this cleaning up the noise. It's kind of like in drawing when we do filling in the dots. That's essentially what softening with a brush is. Hopefully by clearing up some of the excess brush marks in that background there, I'll be able to see the ear a little more clearly and either refine it a little more in this stage if I need to, or possibly just move on and begin to apply some paint when this is set up and dry. Every once in a while, if I feel that the paint buildup is too high and I can't manipulate it in the area, or I need to move to a lighter area, I will just wipe my brush off on the paper towel, try to keep it a little dry. Everything here is the same color, so I don't have to worry about getting my brush scrupulously clean or using different brushes for each section, but I do need to wipe it off every once in a while so that I can work with the paint that's in the area up there as opposed to redepositing it accidentally into more vital areas. The inside here now, I'm just trying to even this out a little bit. If I don't have enough paint on there to soften it, for example, if there was so much terp that it dried more quickly, which is a definite possibility, especially in these lighter areas. The lighter areas indicate that there's more terp, so it's probably going to set up and dry a lot faster. In those situations, I'm having to redeposit a little bit of paint with the bristle, and then go in with my Rosemary Badger blend brush and soften that out a little bit to allow me to readjust focus back onto the ear here. So this is my master's choice brush from Rosemary, which is one of my favorite brushes to soften with, or if I need to load a lot more paint and still get kind of a loose painting style, I use this brush as well. Here I'm just cleaning up the noise here. And what you'll see when this happens, when you do this, is that the painting appears more simple right off the bat. It looks like there's a lot less information when you soften everything out, which is natural. I mean, you're taking all the tiny little variations that are suggesting detail and you're smushing them together to make it more of a consolidated shape. So, that has an advantage of allowing you to see an area more clearly, to understand if you've got the bigger picture correct, the bigger relationship of value and shape and edges correct. But you are going to sacrifice the appearance of detail. So when you do this, it's kind of a trade-off. You're saying, well, I need to make sure that this is going in the correct direction, so I'll soften this. But at the same time, that means if I want more detail here later, I'm going to have to actually get in with a tiny brush and paint it. It's not going to be as simple as just leaving this suggestion of information and having it play out and look like more detail there. So you're trading off the suggestion of information later on for the need to later on paint information. But this demonstration here, this limited cast palette painting, is we're following actually more of a traditional approach to painting and a more traditional finish, especially for a cast. We're not going for a direct alla prima look to the painting, so that kind of demands this idea of less trickery. I'm not going to suggest all of this information with a swoop of the brush and have it be off from what's up there but still believable. That's kind of the essence of a more direct alla prima painting. We're trying to do just honest painting, which is match as faithfully as we can the shape, the value, and the edge. And so this is a great exercise for training you to get as precise as possible and really be true to nature. Do some more classical looking painting. But people tend to not find it as engaging, I find. At least maybe it's just the geographic area that we live in over here, but people tend to favor the more bold, direct, loose alla prima painting where you're suggesting a lot more and using the illusions and the tricks to get all these effects, as opposed to just kind of a boring, photocopy look of the cast, which is what a lot of people tend to refer to something like this as. So we're just softening all of this out, trying to leave my harder edges. You can see at the top of the cast and the top of the ear, the helix there, I've left a much crisper edge. That's helping to foil against all these softer edges that I'm creating now by working in there with my Rosemary brush. And all of a sudden it looks like the painting is kind of out of focus. And that's okay. That tends to be what happens. This type of painting is going to, the way we're shaping up it for it to be, it's more of a keep everything kind of simple and soft and slowly build in the hard edges as we need to, as we introduce more and more layers of paint. And it's sort of that idea of tackling each of the elements of the painting individual instead of all at once. We're kind of thinking about edges here, but not too much. I'm really just getting my really hard edges in there, and everything else is kind of hazy. And then as I get more information on there and more comfortable with what's on there, I can start to get a little more precise by looking around the canvas a little more and trying to figure out a little more what my edge quality needs to be. And by now everything is pretty dry and set up on the actual canvas itself, so I can actually just, as you saw, drag my brush right across that cast painting and kind of level it out. Just kind of soften it. throw some finishing touches on here. You'll notice that my painting still is actually a little bit darker than the actual cast, which, as I mentioned before, you can get pretty close with isolation, but you still can't match the values exactly because there are planes of that cast, remember, that are facing the light, turned up towards the light, and so they're catching more light on, for example, the top of the ear and the top of the cast than is potentially possible for me to catch on my canvas without putting an additional light on it. So I could get an additional light on it and light it up so that the white of the canvas is the same value or even a little lighter than the top of the ear or the top of the cast. That would allow me to truly paint the values as they, in isolation. But as it stands now, even though they're under the same lights, the cast is still a little lighter than the white of the canvas, which means I have to key my values down just a little bit there. I'm just finishing up the last of this underpainting here. I should note that you really shouldn't keep your brushes uh, facing down in a bunch of turf on a jar like you see on my table right there. Those are all my cheaper, older bristle brushes that turn into drawing brushes and utility brushes later on. Alright, so here we're getting into some actual painting here. You can't see my palette here. It's not, we didn't feel it was super relevant to have the palette in the shot for this painting because we are just working with an incredibly limited palette here. It's just ivory black is our black, which also provides our blue tints to this painting. A little bit of yellow ochre, and then also alizarin red and some titanium white. Those are the colors we're using for this painting. So it represents a pretty broad range of colors, and as far as values go. So we can hit all of the values we need to for a painting like this, especially with the background being kind of just a dark blue shift. So I can take my ivory black, which is a subtle blue, but can easily be influenced by a yellow or red because it's so lacking in chroma. And I can just shift the blueness or yellowness or redness of that dark value really, really easily there. And I'm going in and I've got a bristle brush, a pretty stiff bristle brush. Actually, not stiff, but firm. It's firm. Kind of velvety almost. And I'm actually laying in pretty pure paint here. There's no medium here, maybe just a little hair bit of oil in here, but it really is more of paint straight out of the tube, and just firmly laying it on to coat the canvas. And the idea is that I want to try and fill in some of the remaining tooth in the canvas, get enough paint on there to really cover it, and then maybe soften it, or if I so desire, I can scrape it like in the limited palette master copy painting. It just depends on how slick I want the surface to end up being. But I'm treating it very similar to how I treated the underpainting here, in that I'm just trying to establish a big, broad area of color and value here. And I'm not trying to get crazy colorful with this. I see students all the time try to see the tiny variations in something like this big dark field back there and look at it so long that they say, oh, well, it looks really red over here and really green over here, and then they really push those colors a lot more than they need to be. But keep in mind that these colors need to be, or your painting needs to be the colors of your reference as you see it when you step back from 5-10 feet away. And so if that just turns into a sort of dark, undescribed, kind of dark bluish, blackish, whatever color, then paint it that way. And then with paint this thick, you can slowly start to introduce more color as needed. Now I am seeing some color variation, so I'm trying to include that in here. And I think the way the camera is keyed and the values are adjusted on my painting, you can actually see a little bit more color on my painting, because I think we have it, the key is a little up on the painting, so you can see more color in the painting than you'll be able to see in the picture-in-picture here. So you can see it is a little more bluish at the top, which means there's probably a tiniest little bit of white added to that ivory black to coax out some of the bluish haze in it. And I am modifying the black as I go down, but I'm not modifying it so much that it changes the quality or the character. You know, it still looks like a black. But it's kind of imperative that we shift our thinking in terms of conceptualizing color to advance it to a more sophisticated state, in that we try as best as we can to eliminate words like black and gray and brown. Those three descriptions of color do more to obscure our understanding and perception of color than help us paint, because black just actually describes a value. It describes almost any color that is very, very dark, so dark that you have a difficult time seeing the actual body color of that pigment. And you can sometimes only see what its true color is when you add a little bit of white or a little bit of a lighter color. Gray just represents any value range that is so low in chroma it's kind of difficult to determine what color family it is. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. It just requires that you isolate more and possibly compare it to other grays or other color families. You put three grays next to each other and it's easy to see which one's more blue, which one's more yellow, which one's more red. It's not hard at all, but when it's a gray in a field of color, it just looks like a colorless gray. And if you paint it that way, you know, just a undescript gray, it will almost always look incorrect because it's not going to fall into the correct key of the rest of your colors. Brown just describes typically low chroma yellow or low chroma red. But the critical difference here is that it needs to be either a yellow or a red, and you have to actually commit to that. You can't just say brown when it can fall in the yellow family or the red family. And so we have to get really specific here and try to eliminate those phrases like black and gray and brown. And even as we're painting this dark wall back here, try to say, oh, well, you know, if I isolate, it really is kind of a dark blue, or it really is kind of a dark reddish color. And you don't have to push that color so much that you end up having this kaleidoscope of colors back there, but you do have to make sure that it leans a little bit there so you can subtly have some of that color influence working into the rest of your canvas. And you know, that's you kind of have to take that on faith right now, especially with the video here. It's really hard to see when we're digging into these really deep values. But if you were to just paint this whole background ivory black, it would completely look disconnected from the actual subject. And this tends to be what happens. People just see something that's a really low value, just dig into a black and paint it all over, and it looks unrealistic. It looks kind of like a poor photograph, because that's exactly what a poor photograph does. Anything below a certain value that it can't really identify the color in, it just assigns this flat black, and that's why photos can end up having this really flat look to them. So we have to kind of rise above that and understand it and try to introduce a little bit more color whenever is possible here. I'm just softening some of this background out here. Again, the camera right now is not keyed with its value adjusted well enough for us to really be able to see clearly the cast shadow that was painted in, but we're going to see that pop up later as more values get adjusted on the painting, and as the exposure settings on the camera shift a little bit for us to see more information as we go.
And why did you start the painting with the background?
Well, it kind of comes down to the comment we had made about the cast shadow on the ear, except that the background, the background is a big, large, broad shape that's what I felt to be easier to get right than the information in the cast because it's so big. It's easier to hit a big target than a small target. So getting that in there right away, I have a little bit higher success of being able to key some of the more challenging subtle grays in the cast. And also, even more importantly, digging into that correct dark value in the background right away immediately makes the cast look significantly lighter. And so now that I have that big, broad, dark background, I'm not going to be afraid to paint the cast the correct value it needs to be. This is why a lot of artists will recommend popping in your background right away, or at least some pieces of your background right away, at least next to the subject you're going to be painting, because by doing that you have a better shot at making sure you paint your subject the correct value and the correct colors and key to it. A lot of times students who try to paint their subject without the reference or the key of a little bit of background that's correct, they just paint it too light or too much color or too little color. So that's going to help me lock in, especially with something as subtle as the grays in this cast here. All these low chroma colors, and you can see I'm really jumping from color family to color family with these grays here. On the right side I have kind of this yellowish low chroma color. On the left side I've got kind of this bluish low chroma. That was way too high chroma, so I'm coming back in and starting to knock that down. And I'm still trying to kind of figure out what my color families are here. So I'm pushing it a little more blue, a little more green. I'm seeing a variety of colors on the cast there. That's kind of hard to pick up in the reference photo. You should be able to pull up the reference photo in a separate window while you're watching this, so you can blow it up and see it a little better, hopefully. But yeah, I am trying to capture as much of the variety of color as I can at this stage. It can always be softened down, and of course, blending wet color into wet color lowers the chroma anyway. So if I'm getting too much color in here, it's a simple matter of taking a soft brush and smearing it together, and then the yellow smears with the blue and the hints of the purplish red that I'm putting in, and it's all going to turn into more of a gray painting anyway. That's ultimately what kills a lot of flesh tones when students try to paint it, is that they over blend. And so when you have all those colors and you blend them all together, it just makes what people call mud or maybe chalky flesh tones, and that's just indicates that the chroma is incorrect on the painting there. So I'm trying to match the values and just lay, as you can see, some pretty thick paint on there. You know, it's not impasto, but it is body paint that's pretty much straight from the tube here and laid on with a bristle brush. So it's got more of this juicy quality to it, like what we kind of imagine a oily paint should have. I'm not thinning it out, and if I could get students to stop thinning out paint, that would solve a lot of my issues as an instructor, because this thicker paint, first of all, allows me to see true colors. I'm not having the influence of transparency affect it, so I'm getting more of an actual statement of what the color is, so that's better for me. So as the painter, I can understand what direction my painting is headed in. But also that's going to allow me to soften my edges, and I can wait as long as I need to soften the edges. I don't need to do it right away for fear of things drying out. But if you paint with too much thin paint on your brush and on your canvas, then it's going to set up and dry in 20-30 minutes, and then you're not going to be able to adjust your edges later on, and you're basically going to have to repaint an area if it's not correct. Whereas here, it's like working with working with oil-based clay instead of water-based clay. Water-based clay, you have to continually keep it wet and try to keep it alive so you can shape it. But oil-based clay, you just build it forever until it's, well, not forever, but you can build it for a long time before it's really set up, and there's a lot more freedom in that. You have a lot more opportunities to get things right before it sets up. So I really am trying to key into the subtle variations of color here because that's what's going to give this its final kind of pop and glow and solidity of it. You know, the values were pretty much already correct with my underpainting. As you can see right here, I'm trying to lock into the actual value of that underpainting there. Um, so really to take it to that next level of glowy instead of staying in the flat world realm of, or have it look kind of like a drawing like it did before, it really has to be all this subtle color variation. So I am trying to seek it out and find it. What I do want to remember is that this is a white cast or a kind of grayish cast. Uh, and that means that I do have to keep my chromas limited to a certain level here. So if we say that there's a scale of 1 to 15 of, whoa, that's wrong, of chroma, you know, we're saying that for this cast painting, I can only hit chroma maybe 3, maybe 4, but probably not. So it's probably like 1, 2, and 3. I'm trying to keep everything at, and just have little subtle variations of chroma in different color families, and that'll give me enough variation to help this cast really start to glow here. So I'm laying some thicker paint in here for the light so I can really try and catch some light and make it appear a little brighter than it actually is, a little lighter than it actually is. Don't be afraid of your white in this painting too. With cast paintings, students tend to not use enough white actually, which is the only time I will probably ever use that phrase. And it ends up making it so that their cast tends to look muddy because the values just get a little too dark. And that tends to happen when you have a value that's sort of out of place in the overall structure of values and it's a little too dark for an area. For example, if you do it on flesh tones, it can look like somebody has dirt on them somewhere if the value is just dropped and spiked too low. So we really have to control the values here, and to do that in this case, you're going to need to make sure you really are using enough white paint. And so I recommend for something like this, you know, get a big pile of paint, maybe 6 or 8 inches circular that's white, and then slowly add little bits of your red, yellow, blue in there to modify the white, but really try to keep it, you know, this lighter value overall, and make sure you're still isolating a lot. Even though we did that underpainting there to sort out the values, it's really easy to lay a color on top of there and not realize that that color is the wrong value because you're being distracted by, you know, the qualities of the color, how good the color looks, or how wrong the color is, or something. So make sure we're still isolating a lot as we look at the as we start to lay the color in there.
If you lay the wrong color down, would you suggest lifting it off or painting over it?
It kind of depends on the situation. In something like this, when we're dancing around chromas that are so low, you can probably just add a little more paint and let it kind of fuse together and mix in there and sort of overcome it, as long as your paint buildup doesn't become like really thick impasto, unless that's your intent. And if it's so far wrong that you know, your chroma is way too high and the color family is not nearly as close as you thought, then it may be wise to lift it off. But you are going to have to be careful. You don't want to end up accidentally lifting off your underpainting and having the incorrect key left over and causing you to lose your values. And digging into the ear now, we're really starting to help it glow. You'll notice at this point you can't really see all of the greens and yellows in the reference photo that we're seeing in the painting there. It's not quite showing up enough, and this will often happen too, where you might not see in a reference photo colors as good as you can see in life. It just depends on whatever camera you might have been using, and you know, lenses, and there's a lot of factors going into the quality of a photo. And this is why artists will always recommend doing a color sketch of something in person and then using that color sketch while you're working from the photo. And you can see how the introduction of some of these warmer green tones and yellow tones in the cast are actually helping it glow and vibrate a lot more even than the reference photo, which may have been adjusted to be a little too lacking in chroma perhaps because it's a little flatter overall. whereas the cast will start to take on a little bit more of some glowing qualities with these warms that are being introduced in there. So make sure you really do stay true to the colors you're seeing isolate quite a bit. And beyond that, you're going to find that you have a lot of flexibility in which direction you can go with the color. You can actually shift the color families a little bit sometimes, or even some of the color temperatures a little bit sometimes. If your values are strong, it can still play. In this sort of situation, we've had a lecture last term about warm lights and cool shadows and cool lights and warm shadows, but here we're dealing with a situation where there is a white light on this cast. So I can't lay down a blanket rule saying make your shadows warm here, make your shadows cool here, and that's why we're seeing some shifting between bluishness and the warmish kind of greenishness here, because we don't have a standard rule to follow. If we put a really warm light on there, we definitely see some blue shadows. If we put a little cool light on there, we definitely see some warmer shadows, but we don't really have either. So this requires you to just actually observe and throw the rules out the window here, and try to paint it as honestly as you can. And if you hit the color temperatures right, your painting will sing. If you don't, they'll fall flat. So that's going to be sort of your guideline. I've got a different brush for my lights here, you can see, than I was using for my darks. That's because I'm trying to dig into some much lighter values and colors in here now. Just trying to push a little bit of paint around. Remember, every time you blend paint, the value is going to lower. Your edges are going to get a little more smushed. Your color is going to get a little less clean. So you can push some paint around, but be really cautious about softening it, especially at this stage. If you soften something like this at this stage, you would probably ruin all of the figuring out work that you've done and basically be back at square one trying to revisit everything and refigure it out. There's a pretty specific process to softening that we're going to want to try to follow once we get the paint laid down on here. I would also recommend too, for an assignment like this, especially depending on how much time you have to commit to it, give yourself a little leeway on the drawing, especially if you're not entirely comfortable with the process and the idea of drawing at this point. Remember, you're trying to absorb qualities of painting, and it's assumed at this point that your drawing skills are very high already, and you've sort of locked into this idea of drawing that there's a certain percentage of likeness to your subject that must exist for believability, and beyond that, it's sort of academic whether or not you match things exactly correctly. So, it's nice to push yourself and try to get your shape of the ear or the lobe or the cast itself or whatever to be as close as you can to the reference. But if you end up sacrificing your values for it, or heaven forbid your paint application for it, then you destroy the qualities that make a painting a painting. Then even if your shapes are correct, it's still going to be a terrible, terrible painting. So you have to find that balance there. Give yourself a little leeway. Certainly in your student years, I do recommend trying to be as close to accurate as possible, but depending on your painting style, you may need to adjust for the idea that you can let some shapes be a little less than perfect in order to preserve the color in the paint application. Now this type of painting, a little more classical in nature, will see to it that we're going to have a couple layers on here, which means we will be able to adjust some shapes to a minor level as we move forward. but unless something is really critical and has to be adjusted, we don't want to do any major shape changes. We want to keep everything pretty close to the way it is and just subtly shift things in one direction or another as we go. I mean, I think this whole cast painting, we're sped up 2 or 3 times here, so we're only talking about um, maybe 9 hours of painting total on this. Just a couple sessions, maybe even 7 hours. It might only be sped up 2 times. So there's sort of a debate you have to have with yourself, which is, do I want to spend another extra 10 hours on it to coax the shapes to be a little more precise, or can I be satisfied with the drawing being a hair off and having the painting the quality that it is, at the end of how we're at? And so that's a question you're going to have to ask yourself. That'll ultimately kind of determine what type of painter you are. First of all, how accurate your paintings will be in the long run, and secondly, how the aesthetic of your painting looks. As paintings are worked and worked and reworked, they develop a certain quality to them, a certain paint buildup that is different than a very, very direct painting. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, what is that overall aesthetic you want your paintings to have?
Are you thinking about paint application at this point?
Not more than the idea that it needs to be a certain buttery consistency, and not thinned out too much, and it should lay on pretty smoothly. But I'm not really thinking about as much the size of the brush stroke, except when I'm getting to a smaller shape. Maybe I'm trying to make a smaller paint application. I'm not thinking about trying to get transparency. I'm not even really thinking too much about soft on, soft off. I mean, these are just representing kind of little tiles, little strokes of paint on there that I'm going to worry about the actual quality of later on. Worry about it in so much that I'm going to try and obliterate all evidence that there's paint strokes on here, or pretty close to that. I might leave a few, but this is the very idea of classical paintings, where you the artist are not as important as the product that's being shown. You don't want to leave your hand on there, your evidence of working on this painting. And so there is a certain level of freedom there, in so much that you don't have to think about every brush stroke every time to the level of intensity that you do if this were a direct style of painting. If you're interested in the more direct style of painting, certainly you're going to want to watch the Alla Prima still life video that's coming up. And I think I do touch a bit on the qualities of, thinking a little bit more intently on each brush stroke. And, I probably make it look a little easier in the video than it should be, because really you should be thinking about it for a minute or two of brush stroke and laying it down. But I am giving a demonstration. I'm talking through the whole demonstration, so it's a pretty fluid process. It almost looks as fluid as this. Like there's almost no pause or break in what's going on. But really, it should be something that you consider as being very thoughtful, because you're trying to capture a lot of texture and a lot of the length, the variety of each brush stroke, and all that sort of stuff with every single brush stroke. Here I'm just laying it down, trying to get a piece of paint on there that's the correct size and as close to the value and color as the reference that I see. And so beyond that, I'm not having to give any special extra thoughts to the application of the paint. So I mean, that's kind of nice. It allows you certainly to focus more on just the color and the value. You're not trying to think of that sort of next level challenge of making sure everything's correct with every brush stroke and wiping it off if it's wrong and trying again, and going through that whole process, which is very, very slow and very, very thoughtful, which is kind of counterintuitive to the sort of quality of the painting itself, which looks like it's painted very fast and direct and active. Where something like this, you can just really pile paint on, and go very, very quickly, especially if you're locking into the correct gamut of colors here. And then you can separate your idea of fusing the paint and blending the brushes and the sort of aesthetic of the painting for later on, when you can think about it more individually. Just going back in now, working the core shadow. Try to remember to include the anatomy ideas that we had talked about in the drawing year. You know, if you really want something to look three-dimensional, make sure you address that core shadow. Just keep in mind that core shadows typically have some color in them, and a lot of artists actually choose to spike the color in the core shadow because it helps really pop out the turning of the form. Again, you don't necessarily have to do that here, but you do want to try to really observe what color it should be, and it's very challenging to do so on a shape as fine and narrow as a core shadow. That small, anything that's small is very, very challenging to see the color of, and you're probably going to need to actually walk quite close to your subject, maybe even use some binoculars to see actually what it needs to be. Otherwise, you might just miss it completely. And if you just resort to making it a generic black, gray, or brown, like we talked about, then you're going to end up lowering the realism of the painting. Everything's just going to flatten out. So really be aware of, especially those accent colors, those accent notes of really light or really dark that we'll actually get into later on in the painting, because those are the really dangerous colors, because you know they're so tiny and they're surrounded by generally fields of bigger color that it's very tough to see what they need to be, and that represents the greatest opportunity for us to accidentally put in uh, a color that's just not color. So we really need to make sure that we're observing very carefully, getting as close as we need to make sure we can hit the right color, those little core shadows, those little accent colors. Again, I also want to make sure everybody remembers to use a light brush for the lights and a darker brush for the medium values. And then if you're going to go into the darker darks like the background, it's a good idea to pick up another brush for that. Ultimately, you have, again, a lot of flexibility when it comes to color, especially if you stay in the correct saturation or chroma range. But value does not give us as much leeway. And so if you use the same brush from lights to darks, you're going to end up cross-contaminating colors and values, and then things can really start to go sideways. You can do it, you know, especially if you're short on funds and really have to just use a bare minimum number of brushes, but you're going to have to make sure your brush stays extra clean, and you may find that you're going to need to layer paint on quite a bit thicker so that you can overcompensate for the color that's already on your canvas. It's just going to be a lot more of a fluid process if you keep brushes for different value ranges already on hand, at least two or three. A light and a dark minimum, a light, medium, and a dark tends to be a little bit better. And then pulling out your final extra accent brushes for your really light lights and your really dark darks later on. So remember to keep squinting while you do this. I'm doing that frequently while I paint, and I also even let my eyes go out of focus a little bit. Sometimes I just close one eye and sort of half squint the other and let it go out of focus so you can just really see things in blurry, floating shape form. Lets you really lock in onto just the color and the value of something. You know, not squinting so much that you really change the value, but just a little squinting, but mostly letting your eye go out of focus. And then just flicking back and forth between your subject and your reference.
And does that help see the color as well as the value?
Yeah, letting your eye go out of focus lets you see color more clearly. It's going to do all of the kind of smushing together of detail to let you see just the generalized color of an area. Um, Whereas squinting just helps you see value relationships, not even true values, just the relationships. But letting your eyes go blurry out of focus just lets you see floating blobs of color. So no detail. You'll get a vague idea of the shape, but mostly just the color in its true value form. I'm going to go in and restate some of the darks inside this ear. I'm trying to go a little more delicate now, a little more precise But notice I'm really only doing a stroke or two each time before I go down and lift up some, pick up some more paint. I've seen, especially on the replay of some of these videos, I've seen some students lay down, 50, 60, 70 brush strokes with each piece of paint they pick up, and quite frankly, there's no way they could be picking up enough paint to last them that many brush strokes on here. So you need to make sure you um, pick up a new little bit of paint each time. And for, if nothing else, for the very fact that you want to make sure that everything has slightly different color variation that you're putting down there. And that's going to help you achieve that idea of the subtle variation that exists in nature. And that's just a habit that you get into. Anytime you lay it down, you say, oh yeah, that looks correct. Instead of that impulse being, that's correct, let me lay it down as many places as I think I can get away with, you should say, oh, that looks correct, let me pick up a new piece that's almost the same as that, but very, very slightly different, and lay it down right next to it. So that when you step back, it blends and looks the same, but up close, it gives you all that variety and richness that the real world has.
So with each brushstroke, you're really mixing a new color.
Yes, yeah, and that's why doing this with little pre-mixed puddles of paint sometimes is not as successful for students. When I get students who try to mix everything with a palette knife and lay it down, especially with the time frame we have to work on these assignments, they ultimately don't get much covered, and what they do get covered ends up being very wrong because they spend so much time mixing that they want to maximize their use of that color, so they put it everywhere, and everything looks really flat and not believable at all. Where the better option is to have a what we call open mixing, which is having a big puddle of paint on the palette. In this case, it's going to be a big puddle of really off-white gray and a big puddle of a mid-value gray, and then slowly modifying pieces of that puddle, kind of working around the perimeter or even inside if you need to, where each time you lay a stroke down, you subtly shift, add a different red, yellow, or blue to that puddle, and then white is needed to maintain the value, and then lay it down next to it. So doing it on the canvas allows you to see this new, slightly different color in context to the original color before you set it on there, so you can make sure that they're close enough together. And sometimes you might add a little bit of a color into that puddle on your palette, and it might not even look significantly different to you, but it is different. It's just so subtle that even you might not be able to detect it. And putting that down will still allow that subtle variation to creep in there. It's just the act of putting some bit of paint on there, even if it's the same color. If you're mixing your sort of light blue-gray paint and you put a tiny amount of blue in there also, so it looks almost the same, the fact that it has a slightly, 0.1% more blue in it than before adds just enough subtle variation. And that's what will give you the little variation that the whole world looks like. Even if you can't really detect it, it's there, and so it will diffuse into the rest of your painting.
And does that also help with the issue of seeing too many colors in, say, a background or, a shadow side? It kind of unifies the area that you're painting in?
Yeah, for those students who sort of isolate and pick up on, like, I see blue over here, I see green over here, I see red over here, mixing those little colors in isolation will, for most students, guarantee that they blow past the correct color. Because what you're really detecting when you look and stare for a long time at that is a color family that is leaning towards a blue or a red or a green or a purple or whatever. You're not seeing the background color actually jumping to those different color families. And it can be really challenging, especially when we're dealing with lower chroma colors like this, because students have a real tendency to think, swear that they see purple and green right next to each other, and to create kind of a gray that they're looking at. And you can do this idea of like tiny brush strokes with a ton of color that from a distance breaks down into one color but that is a significantly more advanced topic, and it's you're kind of using a little bit of trickery because you're not going to see in real life a high chroma purple and a high chroma green right next to each other on a gray wall, like that. It's just optically they can blend together and create some intensity, but that's not actually how nature exists. So what we're really dealing with is using an open mixing system, a big puddle, and leaning that big puddle a little more green or a little more red or a little more blue, so that compared to your base color, it looks bluish or reddish or greenish. But it is not in the blue, red, or green family. It's still rooted in that family of the first color that you made your big puddle of on your palette. Building more and more paint on here. I'm not really too concerned about how much paint gets on there. It can be softened out once it gets tacky or even scraped down. I am trying to keep it from getting too impasto, so if I end up picking up a bit of paint on my brush and it gets too globular, sometimes I'll just wipe it off with a paper towel and dip back into the puddle to make sure that I have a clean pickup of paint and not a big chunk of paint on my brush. That'll keep things from getting too built up on the canvas here. As I'm laying down these little bits of paint, notice that at this point now I'm really kind of dabbing in tiny little bits of paint that are pretty close, almost right on, but not quite the same color or value as the paint that's underneath, and I'm actually not completely covering that paint that's underneath. So I'm allowing a little bit of those undercolors and initial layers of paint to show through just a little bit, especially in the side, the right side of that ear there where I was just working. That's going to really allow some of that little subtle variation in there. Even if I end up softening it out later on, some of that will still remain and give me a little more variety. Kind of a heavy buildup on that ear. So I'll definitely need to scrape down some of that sort of globular paint up there. But again, I'm not getting too worked up over the aesthetic of the painting right now. Um, it kind of has to go through this stage of sort of globby look so that I can really just focus on the color and focus on the values, and then later on I'll be able to refine it and smooth it, blend it as needed once I've achieved correct relationships. Right now things are still jumping around a little bit too much. I'm using this process of working all over the painting here instead of working one area and completely finishing it, which is actually how I trained to paint. Um, this area can tend to be a little bit more, or this method can tend to be a little bit more challenging for students because it's going to require that as you bounce around, you're able to mix pretty closely back into the color that you were working with in whatever section of the painting. So luckily for a painting like this, which is so rooted in low chroma off-whites, you can kind of detect the little color shift of the grays on the painting, and so that gives you a better opportunity of being able to lock back into it as long as you keep your chroma under control. But there's some areas of this painting where there's still too much jumping. I'm looking specifically at the earlobe on the bottom. It really goes from like a bluish to yellowish, greenish, like it's too much shifting in color family happening right now. Luckily the chroma is all kind of close together, so it doesn't look like it's like screamingly bad, but there is still too much shifting around, and so there's going to need to be more paint modification that happens before any of the smoothing and blending out is going to take place here. And it's interesting because when you read some of the historical texts, they'll actually speak of this. They talk about how paintings can go through these really awkward looking stages, and that's why it's best to never paint friends and family while you're trying to learn how to paint, because they're going to want to look at your painting in progress, and if it looks something like this when you're trying to paint a loved one, then they can sometimes get upset or worked up or not be as flattered as they were hoping to be. And you don't want to have to worry about that while you're doing the painting. You just want to be able to paint and lay the color down and focus on good drawing and good color, and not have to worry about what the person's going to think. So, a lot of these books will say, just dish out the money and pay for a model so that you're not having to deal with the stress of painting family and friends correctly, or having it look good at every stage of the painting. That is the unfortunate thing though as a student, because usually family and friends are the free models. So notice I still haven't really softened any edges yet. I'm not trying to go back and smush anything together. I'm just trying to lay down progressively smaller and smaller pieces of paint to affect edge quality changes, either harder or softer as needed. There were a couple edges that happened to work out right away when I laid them down. Like if you look at the very top of the cast where it meets the dark wall, it's a little kind of almost out of focus, which happened just when I dragged my brush across and it caught one piece of paint. So that kind of worked out pretty well. As well as the bottom right of the cast where it meets the wall, there's little pieces where they kind of got dragged and deposited into each other. So that's nice. They kind of affected that change, but I didn't think about going back and actually softening them to do that. That's just something that happened while I laid the paint down. Whereas here I'm trying to now go in and create all the little topographies on the inside of the ear by putting in extra little pieces of paint and trying to shift the edge quality as I adjust the shape and to lay down a little more color. You go a little closer with color, a little closer with value, a little closer with the specific orientations of each little abstract shape. I'm still not even thinking yet in terms of the form here. So, and this is something that we've talked about in drawing. Really think about the kind of impressionistic quality of lights and darks. And then the next sitting will be really digging into the form idea. Pulled out my Rosemary Master's Choice brush again, the Badger blend, and now I'm going through and I'm going to pick up any excess pieces of paint, and I'm going to try and soften each shape into each other shape here. So every time you see me pull the brush back, I'm wiping it off, and so I do that anytime I move from one color area to another color area to make sure that I don't cross-contaminate the colors too much. I don't want this to end up turning into a just flat gray painting by the end of my softening. I really want it to still exhibit a lot of the color qualities that I've laid in here. I just want the transitions to be a little smoother in between each of these color qualities. So I'm making sure that I soften a little bit out, and then I wipe a little bit off my brush, and then I soften a little bit out, and then I wipe a little bit off my brush. And I am going to start to think about now also my edge qualities, my hierarchy of edge quality. So I'm seeing some hazy edges on some of the shadows that I'm knocking down. I'm going to try and foil that against some of the harder edges in the painting, and really build up a nice contrast. At this point I only have kind of hard edges and kind of a few softer edges. Now I'm going to try and work the whole gamut of edges with my Badger blend here. I pushed it as far as I could in the sitting with the amount of time I have, trying to establish correct edge quality just by shifting color and value. Now I'm going in and I'm actually manually adjusting the edge quality. And the closer you were able to get when you laid down the paint, the easier the stage will be. Because you'll just knock down a few edges and all of a sudden the paint pops out and it glows, and all those colors are retained and things look juicy and rich, and everything is very lifelike. But if you missed the color or missed the value and you soften it, then it'll look kind of um, muddy or dirty or sort of wavy maybe. It'll have that strange quality where it doesn't look as solid. Whereas this softening the correct edges will give it a very solid feel to it. It'll break away the sort of abstract impressionist dabbing of paint and turn it into more of a solid structure where I can start thinking about the form a little more. But if the color was wrong or the value was wrong, softening will not create this structure. And that can be a good thing for a student because that is indicative that you missed a color or missed a value. And you're probably going to need to go back in your second sitting and reestablish a better or more correct set of pieces of color and value to help create the turning of the form and the lifelike qualities here in the picture. It's again, it's the same equivalent as cleaning up the noise in drawing. You know, by doing that, it allows you to see more clearly the real shapes and real values you've established, instead of this sort of broken color, broken value look that it has prior to this. And often in cleaning up the noise, you see things that you couldn't see before, and you see how to push your drawing to the next level. So this is going to do that same thing for you. It's going to tell you where you were close, close enough to make things look really, popping out right from the start, or where you're going to need to go in and do a little bit more work to coax out the painting a little bit more. What you shouldn't do at this stage while you're softening is try to push the paint with it. For example, say, oh, that shape needs to be nudged a little bit. Let me just try and shove some of the paint from one side over to the other side. That's going to end up sacrificing your color in usually both of those areas, and then you're going to have even more to fix later on. So you have to exercise this self-reservation here, which is really unfortunate, really hard to do, where you soften it, you say, wow, that's wrong, but I have to be okay with it right now because there's not enough time, or this isn't the appropriate stage of the painting to put more paint on or try to push it around. You only have so much paint on here, and that paint was intended for the area that you've placed it. And so you just have to put it in the back of your mind as, well, that's something I'm going to come back and fix a little later, but I'm not going to try and sacrifice what I have here and sort of push it to make it a little better. And I can tell you this from experience because I've tried to do that before, especially in Chicago painting a lot, the model's not there anymore, and you look at the painting later on, you're like, oh, this needs to go a little over here, and you don't want to mix a new color because you're not sure you can, and so you just try to push it, and then you just ruin a whole area of your painting because maybe it gets too thin or shifts the color value too much. It really tends to destroy edge quality in an olive premium painting too. So you're just going to have to bite the bullet and accept the fact that it's not what you were hoping it would be, and then give yourself another chance to do it in the next sitting. So this is turning out to be a pretty decent first pass. Again, there's not a whole lot of detail in here. I wasn't really thinking in terms of detail, which ends up being a more academic kind of mindset detail as opposed to an impressionistic mindset. I was thinking completely impressionistically for this painting. Just squinting down, letting my eyes go out of focus, trying to capture the overall little dabs and variations of colors and bits, not so much thinking little pieces of anatomy or anything. And after the softening, it's already starting to fold into a more anatomical, academic type, classical painting. uh, you should use, just like with the brushes for applying paint, a different brush for softening the darks and a different brush for softening the lights, just to ensure that you don't cross-contaminate them. You can probably get away with, in a situation like this where your colors and values are so close together, with just using one brush for your lights and one brush for your darks. But if you're dealing with a painting that has a lot more variety of color in there, you're probably going to want to use more brushes for the softening, because you want to keep your brush completely dry. You can't dip it in any turp or any cleaner at this stage. You can only wipe it off. If you dip it in turp and try to soften, you're really going to strip the paint from your painting right here. So it's better to just use multiple brushes to soften the different areas of your painting. And the cleaner you want your painting to be after the softening, the cleaner you want your color to be, the more brushes you use to do the softening. That's going to be especially true when we get into portraiture, where we have a lot more variety of color happening throughout the face. Historically, you can read about how they would paint the face kind of in bands, so 7 bands going across the head of different colors, and then they would step back 10 or 15 feet, and if those bands optically blended to get the color qualities of the model, then that indicated that they hit the correct colors and the correct values, so they take 7 different brushes, one between each band, and soften them, and that's how you'd get that really crisp, clean, almost porcelain, glowy flesh tone where you haven't deposited any muddy color into any other muddy color. But you got to have a lot of brushes, and more than that, a lot of patience and self-preservation to do that. You can see as I've softened this out, I've actually lost some of the value that I've placed on that ear at the bottom. And like I mentioned before, that happens. The more you blend colors together, the more you're going to migrate the colors towards a mid-value, the more you're going to lose the edge qualities, and everything's going to get softer and softer, the more your colors are going to migrate towards a mid-gray. So that happens anytime you soften a lot, and so you have to kind of anticipate that. That's why there's really not a huge point in putting your lightest lights and your darkest darks in this early, because if you soften the painting out to give yourself a base to paint on later, you're going to just completely destroy those values and those colors, and you're going to have to repaint them anyway. So noodling those smaller details is not really that important at this stage, because it just means you're going to have to noodle them again later.
So is it a bit like stumping in the drawing process?
Yeah, but it's a little more controlled than that. The way we introduced stumping in the drawing program was more at the very beginning. So that would be like the underpainting, open grisaille portion of this. Whereas this is more of like a controlled stumping. I mean, it is essentially stumping, and you could build up a drawing even in the later stages and just stump between each area to clean it up. But this is more kind of like the filling in stage, filling in to clean everything up to give yourself a better understanding of the values and shapes, and give yourself a better base tone. Now, there were certainly academic drawings, many academic drawings that were stumped with kind of the window shading method, which was starting with the shadow map and then just taking the stump and dipping it into a little charcoal on the side and then shading the drawing one little piece of value at a time, sort of very cleanly working it out. And that's kind of like this, but we don't have that represented in the videos from the previous year. We're on the next session here, so we've done an hour or so of underpainting, and then an hour or two of painting on top of that, and now we're in session 2. So I'm pulling out some smaller brushes. I'm hoping to get into some more, a little more of some finished work in here, or at least a little closer. So I've got some smaller brushes. I'm trying to hit into some of the more specific details, and at least give myself a key so I can start finishing off the some of the shapes in the ear, hopefully. And so you'll see me do this in a lot of videos, especially later on, where I'll put a really bright white piece of paint or dark piece of paint somewhere on the painting so that I know my extreme value range that I can potentially paint. And that's kind of what this little highlight that I just painted is going to do for me for the ear. I don't want to set a giant glob of paint on anywhere on this painting because I've actually built it up quite a bit already. Um, so I'm instead opting to lay in that really light piece of paint. And that highlight, just keep in mind, it wasn't pure white. There was a little bit of color in there. Um, Pure white paint would end up flattening out the painting quite a bit. So there was some color in there, but not a lot. And I do notice that when students try to put color in highlights, they tend to end up making the highlights too dark. So you really have to make sure you're starting with a lot of white paint and adding just a little bit of your colors in there. Um, and if you want those highlights to really sing, try to stick close to just one color that you're adding into the highlight. Two at most, but try to keep it to one. That'll keep it light, and it'll keep it bright, and that'll help it really make it glow. Now I'm going in to add some of the darker darks in the ear. I'm hoping that I can key in one area of this painting um, to a little bit more finish to allow me to hit the rest of the painting a little faster here. I'm using actually just a synthetic brush here with some soft white fibers. It comes to a point so I can do some really nice detail work in here. This is just a generic one. They don't last very long at all. Rosemary brush does have a pretty nice one that's was actually, they make it for cake decorators, really. But they're a synthetic fiber like this. They come to a nice point and a variety of sizes, and I think they actually sell it in a set. And they're really nice because you can get that point in a variety of different sizes. So depending on the painting you're doing, you can just pull out the one you need to work with. And I usually like to get two of those sets so I can have one for lights and one for darks. And I really move to those towards the end of, or maybe like the midsection of a painting like this, where I'm not really getting into super fine details, but I am trying to zero in quite a bit more. Usually for the really fine stuff, I'll go to like a pointed sable, which is like a super high-end version of a cheaper brush like this. So I'm adding little pieces of paint in here and just working it into little bits of area. And as you can see, that's kind of softening the edges while I'm modulating the value and color. And hopefully, if you have this much of a base of your painting, you can kind of be freed up to start thinking about handling more things at once. You know, this painting started out in the classical idea of doing the drawing first, and then doing the underpainting, which is just one color and a few values, and then working into the base color on top of that, which is all kind of just the general color. And so that sort of gets us closer and closer and closer and closer to the truth of what we're seeing here. And so now hopefully we can mix well enough with this limited palette of these off-whites that we can think about a little bit of color and value and edge simultaneously and zero in, because at some point you do have to think about all of them. You know, it's great to break this stuff up in stages, but unless you're doing like a truly glazed painting, you are always going to have to be at some point switching over to thinking about shape, value, and edge and color all at once to at least finish off the painting. You can creep up on it and give yourself a better and better and better base, so you can hopefully have more and more confidence as you get up to that stage. But there is going to have to come a time where you just kind of bite the bullet and start to contemplate all of these aspects at once. And that's the thing that I think scares students the most. You know, there's so much opportunity for failure when you have to think about so many things, and that's why the step-by-step process of painting and drawing is so reassuring to students, because there's always a fail-safe. This is what you do if things go wrong. You know, just do this in this order and things will turn out correct. And for the most part, it will. But there's going to be some point where you have to just bite the bullet and try to do as much of this as you can at once. And, you know, that's better for you anyway. That flexes the intellect a little bit, all those problem-solving skills. If painting were as simple as following just a step-by-step every time, it would be very boring. Remember, as you start to work in each stage or each section of this painting, you really should be isolating once again to make sure that what you lay down is a good choice to build on top of. It doesn't make a lot of sense to put all these more finishing marks on top of a foundation that is off by a value step or two. So do make sure you isolate, but once it comes down to these really smaller shapes, smaller details, finer edges, isolation is actually not going to do much for you, and that's where the challenge becomes. That's why we have to do all of that, the sort of visual training, all these exercises that we've done the last year and a half, because eventually you get to a point in a painting or a drawing where you have to eyeball it. You have to say, okay, well, given this set of relationships on the painting, this is the choice that I need to make, be it lighter, darker, more red, more yellow, more blue, softer, harder. You know, all of those choices have to be made without much of a marker for comparison when we're dealing with life, because in real life we can't just blow it up and crop it like a photo and then set the photo next to our painting and then match it exactly. It doesn't really work that way. So there has to be some point where you say, okay, well, I'm giving this my best shot and best judgment for what I understand the overall set of relationships to be up in this small area, and so that's why I'm making these decisions that I'm making. And that's really challenging for students, and that, I think, represents a large reason why the jump from two-dimensional to three-dimensional is so challenging, because you have to be doing a lot of these exercises that we've talked about. You have to be doing the sketching notans to be able to fine-tune your shapes at this level when you can't, when measuring sight size isn't going to help you adjust the subtle angle of an earlobe. You have to be able to eyeball that, and that's when all that sketching comes in. You have to be doing color studies from life every single day so that you can see the subtle discrepancies of a color shift here versus a color shift there. Anything where you're really thinking about color at the forefront of your painting. You have to be walking around constantly squinting and observing edge relationships just out of mere curiosity as you walk around in your everyday life and try to see the connection between all of them. These are all just little things that you have to incorporate into your sort of daily regiment so that you can produce better paintings and get to a finer and finer level. Because there's going to come a point when all of the manual measurement when working from life isn't going to do much for you, and you have to go the final little piece and just isolate, or well, not isolate, but just go off of your visual acuity and set and key the relationships from there. I think most students try to say that or blame that the model moves as being the hardest part of working from life. And, there are some models that do move far more than they should. But what I found, at least when it comes to drawing, is that it's just a very different shift from two-dimensional when you have to just use your eye so much more. You have to eyeball so much more. I mean, you can do all of the basic measurements, keying everything correctly from sight size and getting the major angles, major tilts, and even landmarks with really formal measurements. But after that, it's all how well have you trained your eye to see subtle value shift, to see subtle angle shift, to see little tiny color discrepancies. And that's a lot of experience in there, and that's a lot of practicing and studying and sketching. If you don't have one already, I'd recommend getting one of these canes. They're a lifesaver. When we were doing drawing, it was much easier to anchor your hand on the paper and just reach in. But now when you're dealing with a painting that is completely wet, a mall stick is going to be your friend here. And these canes are just cheap bamboo canes. I think they were $3 from the local party store here. And so they're nice and lightweight, a little bit flexible, so you can push on them just a little bit and get in there and work the painting. So I'm getting a little more detail, but I think I'm still pretty much thinking kind of impressionistically still at this point. Really just trying to zero in on the correct value and color, and just putting little pieces of paint in there without thinking too much about the structure or the like hatching or cross hatching of the strokes that might come a little bit later. Really just trying to lock into that contrasting value and color relationship that we see in the reference in the top right of the screen there. It's going to be imperative also, again, that you make smaller marks like I'm making here, allowing some of that underpainting to show through just a little bit. I have seen students kind of just completely paint over their previous work from the day before, or the session before, um, so much that it ends up looking flat because they think they've got a little closer to the value, and they again just lay it kind of everywhere without letting any of those underlayers come through, and then again you kill that variety that you've built up. So I'm doing smaller marks. I'm also picking up a lot of paint every couple of strokes and trying to shift the color a little bit. Um, and even if I am doing more strokes or bouncing around a little more, I'm still allowing that layer underneath to kind of sparkle through just a little bit to make sure that the area doesn't get too flat. And again, I am using just pure paint here. There's no medium right now. A lot of paint straight out of the tube nowadays is formulated so that you really shouldn't even need to use much medium at all. You should be able to dig in just directly with the paint. So when you're using something like Utrecht's paint or Rembrandt or even Lucas or Gamblin, you can paint pretty much directly just with the paint. And even some of the nicer higher end brands like Michael Harding, you can use just paint directly out of the tube there, and it's a lovely creamy buttery consistency that allows you to not have to use any medium at all. We can just lay paint directly on there. And you're going to find, if you haven't painted like this already, that once you key into the correct pressure with the correct brush, painting is going to feel just a lot more smooth and buttery overall. You're going to feel the difference, especially on an oil primed surface, that it's how paint is supposed to be handled a little more. It's going to flow a little more evenly. It's going to settle more appropriately. It's going to have just the correct amount of transparency and sheen to it as it dries. It's not going to be too kind of dry or flat. Notice also every time my brush pauses just a little bit, I'm looking back at the reference and just trying to make extra sure that the direction of my stroke is where I want it to be, um, that I'm making the correct decision. And I usually try to pause right before I lay that um, lay that stroke down just to make sure, give myself that little extra second to think about it. And then when I go to paint, I'm usually try to be pretty confident in the decision that I've made. Um, and not too timid with laying the paint down. That timid quality will kill your paintings. You know, you won't lay it down strong enough, thick enough, direct enough, and you won't exhibit the qualities of an oil painting that you want. Also keep in mind that even though my limited palette is yellow ochre, ivory, black, and alizarin, the amount of alizarin going into these colors is so very, very small that it represents just a real minority in my color scheme here. And that's okay. You don't have to use equal proportions of your limited palette in the painting just for the sake of using them. Only use them if you really need to. If you only need 2 colors to paint a flower, then just use 2 colors to paint a flower and then pull in anything extra as you need to. And the more you limit that palette, the better the odds are that you're going to have a unified looking painting. Notice I've got my light brush for the area surrounding the dark shapes and my dark brush for the darker areas in the cast. I am trying to get these really, really subtle fraction of a value step changes and tiny, tiny little color changes in here. And granted, you probably at this level of your training aren't able to see and modulate those values at this stage yet. But just try to do your best, get as close as you can, as subtle as you can, and then as your visual acuity gets better um, and your visual approximation for color and value shifts get better, your paintings can get more and more subtle as you go. Also, getting close to your subject will help you see some of that subtlety, but often it can be dangerous because getting too close will cause you to over model something, push the values too much. So getting close is good to kind of see color, but with values sometimes it can become very dangerous. You don't want all the sections of your ear to be modeled from dark to light. There needs to be some hierarchy of light there. And that hierarchy is easier to see from a distance. It's just harder to deduce what the little individual pieces of paint that make it up are.